SafetyNet webinar series. Today's session is presented by Madeline Young and Sean Ronenberg of Polaris Aero, discussing normalization of deviance and waivers management. I'm Catherine Hilst. I am the BAO Training Programs Manager. And just for everyone's information, due to the size of the audience, everyone is on mute, and you stay on mute during the course of the presentation. There is a location for you to type in your questions or comments. Please feel free to do that at any time, and we'll look at those after the presentation. We're excited to welcome back Polaris Aero to the ISBAO SafetyNet webinar series. This webinar will analyze how recurrent deviations, informal practices, and frequent waivers can gradually weaken safety standards if they're not managed systematically. We'll focus on early identification of deviations, analysis of waiver patterns, cumulative risk assessment, and reinforcement of clear operational boundaries, transforming this data into actionable information for preventive decision-making. Our presenters today are Madeline Young. She is an aviation system safety engineer and the Vice President of Product for Polaris Aero. She's responsible for leading the development and execution of Polaris Aero's product roadmap, ensuring the company's safety and risk management solutions align with the Polaris mission and vision, customer needs, and applicable industry standards, regulations, and best practices. In her current role, she works closely with customers, developers, and industry stakeholders to translate operational safety challenges into practical, scalable software capabilities. She's also a licensed private pilot and holds a Master of Engineering degree in Advanced Safety Engineering and Management from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and a bachelor's degree in air transportation from the University of Nebraska at Omaha Aviation Institute. She's also a graduate safety practitioner recognized by the American Society of Safety Professionals, an active educator and industry contributor. Madeline serves as adjunct faculty for both the University of Alabama at Birmingham and University of Nebraska at Omaha. Sean Ronenberg is the client onboarding specialist at Polaris Aero. He specializes in technical support and training as it relates to safety processes and the use of VOCUS technology. He works with flight departments and other aviation stakeholders to turn their SMS into practical action on a daily basis. Before joining Polaris Aero, Sean worked as a product manager with an international flight planning provider, overseeing the implementation of flight planning and safety-related software solutions. He's an Embry-Riddle graduate and holds commercial pilot and aircraft dispatcher certificates. Madeline and Sean, welcome. Thanks for being here again, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. We're very excited to be back to wrap up the spring webinar series by Polaris, and hopefully IBAC will have us back, and we'll see you again in the summer or the fall. So stay tuned, hopefully, for more on that. I do also want to make a slight correction as well, that Sean has now joined us as a product manager for the company. So he and I work very closely together, and we're obviously bringing you this presentation where we'll share a little bit about our product as well towards the end of the presentation. But we are going to get started really just by talking about normalization of deviance. And we'll get into some other concepts like the illusion of control and the idea of sense making and whatnot throughout the presentation, really just to set a solid foundation and groundwork and understanding of why this topic is so important and how it can be abused or really mislead us in our operations if we don't really attune to it and factor in all of these different elements that we're about to talk about. So I just want to start by saying that normalization of deviance is something, if you've heard it before, you might recall it as something that's about, people breaking the rules or find a way to skirt around the rules or a regulation or a policy or procedure. But really, it's happening all the time because it's that quiet acceptance that we have in our operations that often makes sense in any given moment or any period of time. And that work then is repeated over time and maybe doesn't produce any sort of immediate outcome, and therefore it becomes a part of our normal work. So the deviation away from how we intended to function or what our policies and procedures say we should be doing, when that drift becomes normalized, that's really what we're talking about with that phrase, normalization of deviance, until hindsight 2020 reveals that your organization has really moved pretty far away from its intent or those defined attributes that we just talked about. So the goal of a waiver or a deviation approval process is not to create bureaucracy. It's right. It's not to bog us down. It's not to take more time than we need to do our operations. What it is helpful for is to help us pause and take the time that we need to engage in processes like sense making and prevent ourselves from abusing a method of skipping the rules, even if it's just temporary, right? It's really about creating visibility and accountability and an opportunity for us to learn as we navigate our real operations. I want to start with you thinking about a procedure as a sidewalk on the left-hand side. That sidewalk in everyday life is designed very with intention, right? Someone looked at this environment, said we needed a sidewalk, we need people to get from point A to point B, and we're going to build a path that's, safe, that's clean, that's predictable, that's usable. And that's really what aviation policies and procedures are supposed to be doing, right? They're supposed to kind of function like that sidewalk. They create structure, they reduce ambiguity, they help us work through a complex environment without having to reinvent a path every single time. But over time, people might start cutting across the grass. And at first, it might be because someone's in a hurry. Maybe it's you're following the person who went in front of you, and because they did it that way, you're going to do it that way. And then maybe a few more people do it because they realize that they don't really like the windy path. They just prefer this other path. And eventually, that dirt path really starts to appear because you're treading through the grass so often. And it starts to appear very normally in a way that we don't really recognize that we're taking a dirt path at all. We're just having a new way from getting from point A to point B. But the important part about this visualization and the scenario in general is that that dirt path isn't automatically bad, right? It's just showing us that there might be something useful that we can learn about the way that we're functioning. Maybe the sidewalk was designed before the entrance to the building was moved, right? Or maybe it's showing us just a more useful way to get somewhere. Maybe it looked great on a map, but it never actually helped people get from where they were to where they needed to go, right? So maybe it was also just poorly designed. For example, this is a windy path, and in Nebraska, we hate windy paths because in general, when it snows in the wintertime, they're a bit of a pain to snowplow. So we like straight and narrow paths, right? It's going to be easier in the long run to plow the dirt path, especially if it became a real one eventually. The whole point is that that path is really a signal to us. And that signal is something that we really can tune into and learn from. But again, the point is that that path isn't inherently good or bad. We can't make a judgment on that now because there's a lot of information that we still need to understand, the reasoning behind it, for example, before we can really make that judgment. And that reasoning also has to account for risk. So we'll get to talking about that here in just a moment. In the aviation context, more specifically, what I'm really talking about today and what Sean and I are talking about today are things like how your manuals describe something, what a policy is around a procedure, what the checklist says you should do, what the approval chain suggests that you should do, right? All of those things, those documented processes, feel like reassurance to us, and they make us feel like the operation is under control. But if we're constantly deviating from them, whether we are doing that intentionally or subliminally, then it's not that we're saying that we're any less safe in that moment, but what we are saying is that you are operating with a reduced amount of margin, which means there's a little bit less flexibility to move in your day-to-day work. There's less flexibility for you to potentially make a decision that could end up having a bad outcome. All that is to say is that there's a lot of variability at play. And when that dirt path is something that you continue to take, what we're saying is it's pretty likely that you haven't addressed the risk, contextually speaking, around that drift every time that you're drifting. That's what normalization of deviance is, right? It's you're kind of accepting that this is a better option without considering that contextually speaking, there might be risks that you need to manage. And what you can do is over time, you can say, okay, we see that that drift is happening, and we're going to manage risk in a really dramatic way, meaning maybe we're going to build a new policy or procedure, actually create a new sidewalk here. Or maybe we're going to say, hey, there really just is too much risk around this dirt path that we aren't thinking about day to day. So we just need to shift back to the policy or procedures that we already have and rely on those. So we've got a couple of examples that'll make that a little bit more clear once Sean gets to demonstrate this in our system. But this is why waivers are really important, right? The waiver isn't permission to ignore the sidewalk. It's really evidence that there is a dirt road, there is drift that is forming, and we need to, after we've dealt with this one particular scenario, we then need to take a step back and say, okay, what is that actually telling us about our entire environment? So there are a couple of questions that we generally are going to be asking. First of all, is the dirt path forming, or is it possible for the dirt path to form? Meaning, is drift happening, or is it possible that drift can happen if we move forward with this decision to walk down the dirt path? Do we need to reinforce the sidewalk, meaning steer us back to those policies and procedures that have grounded us before? Or should we pave a new path? And again, metaphorically speaking, we'll ground that here in just a little bit. So normalization of deviance in more technical terms, more academic terms, right, is that gradual process where departure from a standard or a policy or procedure or an expected practice becomes accepted over time just because it keeps working or it appears to keep working, right? Emphasis on the appears to keep working because we don't know whether or not it actually is. We can't let the outcome of that decision really drive our judgment of whether or not it was a good decision, right? Because that outcome also has to do a lot with luck, as it does risk. So think of something like storytelling, right? A successful or an uneventful outcome can be really persuasive in the realm of storytelling. Let's say we've completed the trip successfully, the customer was happy, the aircraft got where it needed to go, nobody filed a report, we didn't get a call from ATC or a regulator about a deviation or anything, that the hangar's still standing, right? All of these things could be indicators that, hey, that was a good decision. We made the right decision. And naturally we start to say, okay, well, that exception that we made then wasn't really such a big deal, was it? Sometimes that can be true, but sometimes that exception reveals that the procedure initially was just overly rigid, outdated. Maybe the procedure that as it was defined wasn't actually really well matched for our real world scenario. Because when you're writing your manuals, when you're writing policies, procedures, and your checklist, you're doing it with only a limited amount of foresight, right? You can't possibly write those things for every single scenario. So naturally, there are going to be circumstances where deviating from them is really necessary to get you through the situation that you're involved in. But it can also be abused. And that's something that we need to be able to tune into. And that's why we need to treat our waivers not as these exceptions that can happen whenever we need them to, but as really important signals to the greater operation about the quality of those written pieces of documentation. So that's really why this is worth talking about. Our intent is rarely motivated by a desire to normalize a departure from the procedure, right? Our intent is really just to navigate any situation in front of us effectively and with as much margin and as least risk as possible. But as we start to go through that behavior and realize, wow, this is actually can be a really effective tool to get around something, it can start to be abused or normalized over time. What that sounds like in everyday life is something like, well, we've done it this way before, so we can do it again. Or, well, we approved the waiver last time, so why can't we do it this time? Or, we'll document this afterwards because this is really just a one-time thing and we're under some time constraints, right? Like phrases like that are phrases that can cue us into where this normalization behavior is starting to appear. Now, if you've sat in on any presentation about this concept before, or if you know much about the Challenger launch and the aftermath of that, you may have become familiar with this book written by Diane Vaughan, The Challenger Launch Decision. And this is where an idea of normalization of deviance really comes into play. Now, since then, a lot more information has come out and it's been studied greater, and this isn't really the only thing, right, that led to the Challenger outcome, but it is something that is very real in that event that we can learn from, right? So what Vaughan said is really that normalization of deviance is used to describe, in this case, how technical anomalies repeated over time without catastrophic consequence became reinterpreted as something that was acceptable. And slowly those abnormalities became very normal. There's another related concept, though, that stems from this. And I'm not sure if any of you have seen this before, but I think it's a great representation of what I'm talking about. This actually is derived from a sociologist, Leslie Wilkins, who wrote a book back in 1964 called Social Deviance, but it can apply directly to what I'm talking about. And what Wilkins was writing about was, from a sociology perspective, not necessarily aviation, the concept about how these feedback loops that continue to reinforce our behavior kind of create that sort of new normal, and you can kind of spiral out of control, really, which is what this is showing you, where at the beginning of that circle you have your operational normal and you hit that first deviation, and over time that becomes new normal, and you hit the second deviation, it becomes new normal, and so on and so forth. And you just kind of get in this endless feedback loop because you're not getting any feedback that sort of procedure needs to be looked at from a different perspective and can't just inherently be accepted as a deviation because the outcome has only ever been moot or uneventful or positive, for example. So I think this is just an interesting illustration of what it is that I'm trying to talk about, and maybe something that will resonate over time. Eventually, someone will learn something new about that workaround. They learn that the actual process might actually need a different way of interacting with that process, right? Maybe it needs to be rewritten. Maybe we need to look at risk from a different perspective. And by that point, if a shortcut is already created, it's really hard to bounce back from that. So there's a question that we can ask that help us really understand those sorts of deviations and the waiver process in general. And the question we can ask is, why did it make sense at the time for us to either approve or deny any sort of deviation from an instantiated regulation, policy, or procedure? We don't want to ask whether or not we're in violation against ourselves, but what made sense for us to act in this way at the time that we did. Because if it made sense to a capable person or a capable group of people, there's probably plenty of information there that we can learn from. There may be pressure involved. There may be ambiguity of the original procedure. There may be a poorly designed process, like I was saying earlier. There may be just a general gap between how we're intending to function and how we say we're going to function. and that needs to be rectified. And temporarily, a waiver is a great tool to do that. But once that event has come and gone, it can be really tricky for us, challenging, and take time for us to pause and look with retrospect about what else might need to change. So here's some other questions that we can pause and ask ourselves in those moments, right? What risk are we actually accepting? Why are we accepting it? What controls in the system are we relying on to function perfectly to make sure that this approval will lead to an uneventful outcome or a positive one? How often have we done this, or are we doing this? And is this still an exception, or has it actually become an unofficial procedure that we're just choosing to reapprove time and time again? One really interesting example of this that I've seen just in observing how our customers have used our tool over time has to do with duty and fatigue policies. We know that this is a very hot topic. We know that you're required to have fatigue risk management systems. And yet, this is still one of the most common waivers that we see approved over time, because it's an easy thing to do, because it's really hard to not only qualify, but importantly, quantify. How can you tell how fatigued a person is if you're just having a conversation with them and they're under pressure and not comfortable being honest with their fatigue level, especially when you're in a situation where there's a high profile customer, there are time constraints, maybe you have a slot at a particular location that you can't give up because you're flying to the Masters or you're flying to some big event where those slots are hard to come by, right? All of these things can amount to that pressure that might guard someone from being honest and truthful about a fatigue situation. And therefore, you get yourself into this pattern of wanting to approve waivers because the situation calls for you to operate outside of the norm that you've set for yourself. There's a really interesting piece to this that I want to emphasize, and that is that when you're designing your manuals, your policies, and your procedures, it is correct that you can only do that with a certain amount of forethought. However, you are also designing it under the guise of the best interest of the company, right? And the best interest of your people and your operations with a clear head. So those are meant to be the policies and procedures, yes, that you're using on a day-to-day basis, but also things that you should be relying on when challenging decisions are to be confronted, right? A challenging situation is not necessarily the time when you should be interested in deviating from those things that have kept you operating within this comfortable margin set for so long, right? An interesting analogy to this that's really just coming to mind is like a marital prenup, right? Set aside any opinion that you might have of whether or not you should get one. The reality is that when you're signing a prenup prior to getting married, hopefully you're doing so with the best interest of yourself and your partner at that point in time, right? You're doing it under this premise that you're in love with someone and you are in a good standing with them, and you're doing it with a bit of a clear head. Now, juxtapose that with, let's say you didn't have a prenup and you wish you did at one point in time, right? At that point in time, after the fact, you don't necessarily have the other person's best interest at heart. You're probably looking at that situation from your own perspective. And what that's doing is it's really it is changing entirely your perspective on how you're going to handle that situation of your personal finances moving forward. And the reason I make that analogy right now is because the policies and procedures are meant to be there to help you if time gets tough, not just in the day-to-day. And that's a bit what that premarital prenup, so to speak, can do for you. if times ever get tough, you've already gone through that hard decision making, and now you don't have to confront it again, especially with this new reality and perception that probably isn't so positive, that might pressure you into making certain decisions after the fact. So I'm going to jump to a different concept here. And the concept is the illusion of control. And you might have heard about this before. I'm going to set the scene though for this. And what I want you to think about is that normalization of deviance, as we've just said, is about how abnormal becomes normal over time. And the reason that that can continue for so long, like I've just suggested, is because when there isn't an outcome that requires you to really look deeper at those decisions, they just continue to happen. But what's happening underneath the curtain there is that you're under this illusion that you've maintained control of your system through that decision making. Right? We do one thing, it works, nobody gets hurt, nobody reports anything, nobody gets a phone call from the FAA, the accountable executive, whomever, and we're easygoing, right? We can continue to function in that way. We're under the premise that now we have a new way of doing things, but we are still in a risk-controlled environment. But the reality isn't so true, right? The reality is just that we need to take a deeper look because we don't know whether or not the risk has actually been controlled to the extent that it needs to be. So the illusion of control really is the belief that because we've influenced an outcome, we have therefore controlled the risk. And that can be so subtle that we don't know what's happening. That's the trick to all of this normalization of deviance, drift, and the illusion of control, is it's really subliminal. We don't know that it's happening. So I guess I'll pause to make a point here that all of these terms that I'm talking about don't really matter in the day-to-day. What matters is that they're real, right? I don't necessarily care if you remember this phraseology later on. What I care about is that the concepts resonate with you. So, like I said, in aviation, that can feel really subtle, and it doesn't usually sound like, something that's pompous or us saying we're invincible and we, a bad accident will never happen to us, right? That's not really what I'm talking about. It sounds subtle, like, well, we know this crew is capable. We know that airport, we operate there 1 million times a year, right? We know our aircraft, we're the experts in this aircraft. We know our customer, right? We've been the only provider of this customer, and we fly 250 hours with them a year. So of course we know what to expect. Of course we know what pressures they're going to put us under, and that's okay. But that's just normalized. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay, right? So the hard part is recognizing that those statements might be true, but shouldn't discourage you or prevent you from looking at your operations with a more critical perspective under these challenging times when you're needing to operate outside of the limits that you have already set for yourself as things that are comfortable for you to work within. Experience matters. Local knowledge matters, right? Operational judgment, all of those things matter. We wouldn't be able to function without the skilled people that we are, but experience can trick us into believing that we're more successful than we actually are at making decisions. Okay, so I want to move into a different concept just to ground this again a little bit more in some academia, so to speak, before I open it back up to Sean. And what I'm going to show you is how waivers, complexity, and operational margin are all tied together in a different graphical representation. So I've shown this in presentations before, and this is not work that's exclusive to me. This is Todd Conklin and Bob Edwards can be ascribed to be the brains behind this representation. And what we're looking at is over time, so moving from left to right, the black line represents work as planned. the procedure, a policy, a checklist, a way that we expect our operations to unfold over time, right? And we kind of just have this horizontal line, meaning doesn't really fluctuate because it's preconceived. Then we have that blue line that represents how we actually perform. So we underperform and we overperform. That's real operations, right? People are constantly adapting, crews, dispatchers, schedulers, maintenance teams, managers, anybody on the line. We're constantly making small adjustments, small trade-offs, localized decision-making to keep the operation functioning. And typically we're doing that within the bounds of what our operation manuals, policies, procedures, and the regulations say we can do. So that's not a flaw of the system. That's just our reality. We will never function at that black line, but there is the space of that kind of blue line that fluctuates that is generally acceptable until it's not. So the concern is not that that blue line moves, right? It should, and it always will. It represents our real world. The concern is that when repeated deviations begin moving the operation closer and closer to the edge of margin, especially when nothing bad happens, that's what should get our attention. So the reason this matters, and I'll show operational margin in a minute, is because out there looming far away from work as planned, there is this potential for a bad outcome. And that is just always fluctuating because of external things that we can't control, because of how we fluctuate that might put us closer to that line and move us outside of operational margin, and also luck. All of those things are involved in that curvy red line. And potentially the red line and the blue line can intersect. Obviously, that's what we want to avoid. And we can avoid that by trying to stay within our operational margin, right? And that is the limits, the confines that we've set for ourselves that keep us functioning within this safe space, so to speak. So a successful outcome may mean that we controlled our situation effectively, but it could also mean that maybe we didn't control it effectively, but we were still within enough margin that we didn't get ourselves out of that green space and towards that red line. Keeping ourselves within there is the goal. Waiver management can help us do that. Abuse of waiver management or lack of attention to the safety assurance component of waiver management is what can become dangerous and actually cause us to drift that blue line further and further outside of that green space. So when we evaluate a waiver or deviation, a better question is not, is this something that we can approve? Better question is, what does this do to our margin? Are we helping ourselves? Are we eroding our margin? Are we putting us out of that green space? Or are we still within it? And that conversation should be happening every single time. And it should be in light of the controls that you already have in the system and obviously the context. So controls being policies, procedures, checklists, etc. And the context being who's your crew, what's their circumstance, basically what's your risk assessment, right? What is the weather? What locations are you flying to? What lessons learned from the past are you bringing into that risk assessment now to provide more context to what the crew are about to experience? All right, so sense making becomes essential in this because the waiver process will help us notice what exceptions are telling us before hindsight really creates a pattern. So what I'm really talking about with sense making is, and I'll keep this brief, it's really that unique ability that only we have as individuals in any moment in time to take a bunch of inputs, kind of make sense of them, and provide that feedback out, right? That in short terms, that's really what it is that we're talking about. Where sense making can go wrong is if you're blocking yourself from that conversation because of previous success because of this is the way that we've always done it. Basically not functioning much as a sense maker at all in any given situation, but functioning as just a cog in the wheel on the process to get you through to continuing an operation. So that is very important when we specifically are talking about the approval process of our waivers. If a waiver is approved, the organization should not only remember what that decision was, but it should remember why that decision was made. What conditions made that answer acceptable? What assumptions are we relying on when we're having those conversations? What had to remain true in that situation for the decision to be accurate, right? So we'll get into an example here in just a moment that Sean's going to share, that when you are likely approving a waiver, you're approving it under a given context that you're aware of. But if that context changes, are you revisiting that conversation? Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. And how will you know unless you're revisiting it? Okay, so without that context, that past approval can become really dangerous evidence of that type of drift exactly that we're talking about here. So sense making is really about the discipline of not making a hasty decision, knowing that it takes time to build a complex story to help you really understand what that decision is that you're making and whether or not you should, proceed with the approval or a denial. We'll get into this in just a little while about waiver denials. That's a whole other tangent that I'd like to have time to get into. But before we get there, I do want to ground this very quickly in safety management systems. Why does this matter? Because we don't see language like waivers or deviation approvals really show up in ICAO Annex 19, and only in light ways does it show up in standards, right, that we hold ourselves to, like the BAO, the ISBA, or any others that you can imagine. And that's not because those organizations don't believe that they should happen. It's because the waiver process and the deviation process is really found in all four components of safety management systems. Now, real briefly, as we know, ICAO Annex 19 is that standard that brought together all safety management practices under one annex for a single referenceable framework. And that happened years ago, back in 2013. Chapter 3 of Annex 19 outlines how the states should actually manage safety management systems, and that applies to any operator within those states, right? Specifically, section 4.1.1 of Annex 19 says that a service provider's SMS should be built on the standardized framework found in Appendix 2. That's the 4 pillars and the 12 elements that we'll look at, and be scaled to the size and complexity of your operation. So mind you, the types of customers that we work with range from 1 aircraft to over 100 aircraft. So we have a whole range of experience working with operators within that spectrum. And also ones that don't even operate aircraft at all, but still potentially use that waiver process. And so the idea is that these principles apply to everybody. They can be scaled up or they can be scaled down, right? If you're a 2-man operation, you still are probably deviating to some degree from your policies and procedures. The question is, what sort of dialogue are you having about that? And what sort of retrospect are you applying to understand what it actually means about overall how you're functioning? I've used a little bit of language here and there that is really driven from Annex 19 Appendix 2, and that's, again, where the 4 components, 12 elements live. And I'm not going to go through each one of these just for the sake of time, but waiver management, deviation approvals, the core of that comes down to risk management, right? The idea is, are we managing our operational risk? Because presumably we're introducing risk if we are going to operate outside of the confines of what we've set out for ourselves, because that's something that we haven't, looked through the risk lens for yet. But after that, we get into safety assurance, right? That is looking at our performance and seeing how that decision affected us, and also looking at the performance of waiver management over time to see whether or not there's something we can learn from it. So that alludes to safety assurance. Safety promotion with training, education, and safety communication is not only just about the learnings that we can apply retrospectively, but it's also potentially about relying on our training and education to guide us back to policies and procedures when we probably shouldn't be operating outside of the confines of them. Why were they created? When were they created? What lens were they created through? And if that still fits our current circumstance, then maybe a deviation shouldn't be acceptable. And if it wasn't, then maybe it should be. But relying on that training and education and weaving it into that training and education is a very real thing. And then finally, but important as well, is that first component, policies and procedures. The tone of risk acceptance is set in your policies and procedures. And obviously you can see how that would trickle down to the remaining components around this topic. So with that being said, I just want to round out this quick section before we get into a demo that, we've spent the last little while talking about a really real human problem, adaptation that happens generally faster than documentation can happen. It's not inherently good or bad. It's just reality. We're writing this documentation under expected conditions or conditions that we could anticipate. But operations happen under actual conditions with a lot of variability, and we can't anticipate everything. And that waiver process sits in that gap. So that's where these concepts start to become a little bit more practical, right? Normalization of deviance, operational margin, the need for sense making without hasty decision making. All of that really starts to ground us in accountability that our safety management systems hold us to. And it all comes together at a point in time that says we need to do things differently than we've initially planned. And how should that be handled in the future? So the quality of the process for waiver management determines whether that request becomes the request to deviate becomes a thoughtful decision or just another exception that kind of disappears and then becomes normal and then something that we forget about over time. A strong waiver process should make the important parts of the decision really visible. What is the requirement that you're waiving or that you're requesting to waive? What is the operational reason? What are the surrounding conditions? What existing controls are in place? Where are there controls that are too weak? By controls, I mean anything from a policy or procedure to just general decision making about how we're going to go about a particular event. And where your organization might be relying a little bit too heavily on frameworks that are informal, on tribal knowledge, on this is the way that we've always done it, on it was acceptable in the past. So we're going to show you how our waiver tool supports that process in practice. I'm going to turn it over to Sean here in just a minute, how the request is documented, how the reasoning for that is actually preserved, and how approvals are routed for accountability oversight by people that are in positions of sense making, and how the organization can use that information as a part of their broader safety management system. So when you think about procedure and drift, hopefully you can recall back to this little graphic here or some of the ones that I've showed you previously to illustrate not decision making right from wrong, but a different way, and question whether or not you need to build a new road or revert back to the road that you've already created for yourself under a different lens. So that being said, I'm going to stop and pass over to Sean, which is going to take a minute. We have to switch presenter controls here.
All right, hopefully you all can see my screen at this point.
Yep, Sean, can you blow that up and make it bigger?
How does that look?
That looks good. I can see 2 screens, both monitors, but it looks big enough to me.
Okay. Very well. Let me start with, by the way, thanks, Madeline, for setting the context and the foundation of this normalization of deviance. So what I wanted to start with is to bring the principles that Madeline was talking about into kind of a practical, everyday practice. Now, we know that our industry is dynamic, and there has to be a need for flexibility and change along the way, which is why we've built in some that, in our policies, we built in these waiver processes. So a couple of practical questions it would be great, after we're done with the presentation, to go back and introspectively ask yourself are: number one, does my company have a clear policy and guidance related to deviations and waivers that would allow something to occur even outside of the norm? In my conversations with flight departments, it's actually widely varied. Some have no policy, some have something that's very non-specific in general, others have something concrete with clear boundaries. And so you want to ask yourself that question. The second important thing I think to ask as a flight department is, is there traceability around our waivers? Regardless of the system you're using, as an example, what I find is a lot of times that there's a phone call that's made between a chief pilot and a flight crew, right? Can I trace that? Probably not so well. Or are we documenting these requests somewhere formal that we can go back and evaluate those? So again, putting some structure around this is going to protect you. It's going to remove some of that emotion, the pressure out of a decision. And another question to ask is, who is involved in this waiver and deviation process? Hopefully you have somebody, again, outside of the flight crew, and possibly even schedulers and dispatchers. So you have potentially a team of people who can counsel and discuss amongst one another and make an informed decision regarding a particular request. Again, are we approaching waivers with an expectation bias, right, on the one side, or are we approaching it as, no, we're doing this as an operational contingency and it shouldn't become the norm? What I mean by expectation bias is, am I approaching it with the assumption that because I filled out the form, the operation is going to be approved, right? Or are we looking at it with a critical eye, with safety and risk management in mind? So the example I want to set here today is a trip from Teterboro to Madeira, Portugal, which you guys know is in the archipelago over there in the Atlantic Ocean. If you've ever been there, you know about this airfield. This is one of the more challenging, hazardous airfields to operate into for a number of reasons. We have, of course, unexpected wind shear, downdrafts are an issue, localized terrain, and the availability of quality procedures all make for a very challenging situation that for most airlines and operators, there are certain requirements for the crew members to even be approved to go there. So hopefully you're very familiar with that. If you want to go look about YouTube sometime, you can type in Funchal and you'll see the various kind of wild approaches that take place there. So now, as an operation in my example, where we have an approval to go to this airfield under certain conditions, again, under certain boundaries that would keep us within an appropriate risk tolerance. And some of those are included on my waiver in the next screen here, but here is my risk assessment and my flight with the various operational details. And as the crew member, I know, based on the conditions that are presented here, that I'm going to need to request a waiver to do this, all right? And some of those reasons are right here. Now, where should we always start? We should always start with the baseline. Well, what is the restriction? What is that, those sidebars, if you will, keeping us in a safe lane? The restriction is right here. The company policy restricts operations into Madeira at night unless the crew has the appropriate recent experience, that's in the last year, during the day, so they know the visible conditions around the airfield. They've gone through the flight sim training, and the expected forecast conditions are going to be VMC, right? So we've kept this we've put the guardrails up, so to speak. Now, the practicality begins to happen, right? As our lead passenger is delayed by 45 minutes getting into Teterboro, well, now we're faced with this issue of reassessing the flight leg to determine, are we out of duty? Are we going to violate that restriction? And come to discover that the crew, after running a fatigue risk assessment, they're going to be in a higher category of fatigue, right? Number one. Number two, it puts us beyond our standard maximum two-person crew duty limits, right? Now, interestingly enough, the crew here answers a question, and I'm going to actually pause for a moment and say this is a common potential for an issue to happen. As a crew is making a request to do an operation, they'll often be polled for, how is your fitness for duty? How are you feeling? You feel like you can handle this? And the question to ask yourself practically is the crew pressured to say yes, right? Or have you built a safety culture where the crew is confident to say, no, we're not able to accept that. We need to change the plan. So in this case here, I put the example on purpose, right? There's a high pressure passenger who wants to get to a meeting. There's a crew who feels they're okay at the moment, but the reality and the data is showing that by the time they get to the airfield, they're going to be in a higher state of fatigue and potentially in an inappropriate situation. So the next step is to, after you kind of try to make your request, is to justify, can this be done safely? Can this deviation that we're asking to do today, can it be done in a way that has an acceptable level of risk? So we've looked at the weather. Yeah, the weather hasn't changed. That's fine. We found a suitable alternate, brief misapproach, so on and so forth. But I want you to notice something here. I intentionally did this. The crew has stated, yeah, we've been to the airfield before. We know all about it. But what they failed to realize is they haven't actually met the recent experience requirement of the last 365 days. They're slightly out of date, and they didn't realize that without checking the scheduling data, right? So there's a couple things in here I want to point out. A couple of things that push us over the edge to say, well, is this really a smart thing to do? So number one, the crew is going to be fatigued. The data is going to show that, and it's very clear. Number two, they actually don't meet the criteria for recent experience. We're going to submit the waiver anyways. Why? Because we want to stimulate a discussion as a team to evaluate possible alternatives. So you can see over here in my comments, again, you don't have to be using this to have this conversation, right? You can document it in an email or have that conversation in person. But you can see here we've identified, and maybe it was through an analysis of the dispatch and scheduling platform, that the crew doesn't have the recent experience. And in fact, if I go back to the risk assessment, it actually shows that as well. You can see here, PIC has not been to the airport in the last year. So if I have evaluated things more closely, I would have actually discovered that. So we know that we're out of tolerance here already. And I want to pause and say one thing, which is, at these moments, do you try to make a justification to make something happen or to force something to happen, or take a step back and look for an acceptable alternative? Now, in this case, Madeline, who we're going to assume is the DO, came up with a great suggestion. Hey, can't we just use a different suitable airport? Not only is Madeira challenging enough, when we throw on top of this night ops, fatigued crew, and lack of recent experience, I'm not comfortable with it. And lo and behold, yes. And if you've operated in there before, you know that Porto Santo is just a short hop away. It is. Despite its proximity, Porto Santo does not have the challenging terrain conditions or any such thing. It's a very straightforward airfield to operate into. So yes, we can do this. We've briefed with the passenger that they're okay taking the ferry or repositioning the following day, potentially taking that important meeting, on the aircraft over the phone, whatever it might be. But there is an acceptable alternative that keeps the crew in a safe state of mind, if you will, and physiologically and just generally, flight ops, fitness for duty, and it works for the PACs, right? So this process might not have been an instantaneous discussion. We had to have a scheduler and dispatcher pull the records. We had to have the DO, the chief pilot, involved. We had to have the crew involved for their assessment, and all of that leading to there's an acceptable alternative. So again, we show this here because really what we're looking for is feeling confident that a waiver can be declined and coming up with a different plan of action. One other thing that, especially in a challenging environment, and if you want to have more traceability, that you've documented and analyzed the risk, you can add an attachment here in this particular tool, but in general, you can actually create a formal risk assessment where you're going through line by line and analyzing the hazards, the potential outcome paths, and developing a formal risk control so that we have evidence that we've really thought about this and come up with an appropriate plan that meets our flight department guidelines for risk acceptance. So that is the example I wanted to mention here today. Madeline, any questions about that or comments?
No, thanks, Sean. I appreciate that. So what Sean is showing you obviously is what Polaris has, and he made a great comment that whether or not you use this software is beside the point. What we're really talking about is a way to all of those preliminary questions that Sean was asking, right? Do you have a process that defines how you are meant to conduct waiver or deviation requests, how you're meant to handle them and go through that waiver process? Who is going to be involved? Do you have redundancy involved in that decision making? Do you need formal risk analysis? And this is where we get into scalability of SMS, right? Smaller organizations might be able to have that over a dialogue or a text chat or what have you. Larger organizations might need a more solid infrastructure like what Sean was showing you. So it really can be adaptable, but the premise is, do you have a way to handle this? Are you handling it the way that you say you're going to? And then are you doing anything with that information after the fact? So one thing that we haven't showed you, but that this system can do, is it can show you some metrics over what types of waivers you are repeatedly approving. Like I mentioned before, that fatigue and duty waiver that we continue to see pop up time and time again with our customers. And that really shows us that that is one of the first things to be approved. And that's, I think, a really interesting metric that we can start to have a discussion about. Why are we so comfortable continually approving waivers around duty and fatigue when we have seen the effect that that can have over a long period of time? Just because the pilots were able to land there doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't fatigued, right? And I know using the F word is kind of a heavy thing, and we don't like to do that and throw it around lightly, but that's what we've seen kind of happen over time. So looking back at those metrics, having a way to have those metrics, like what Sean was saying, is equally important, so that you can look back at it in hindsight and retrospect and be able to make some sort of sense of it and decide whether or not you need to pave the path or redirect back to the path that's already been paved. Catherine, I know we're up on time, but I think Sean and I can stick around for a few more minutes if there are any questions.
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple, and I've made you the presenter again, Madeline, if you want to share your contact screen or slide. First one is, and this is one that comes up a lot. What's the difference between a pre-planned deviation and a deviation en route, say for TCAS, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll take it first, then pass it to Sean. Obviously, I think part of that's in the name, right? A pre-planned deviation would be something from that you can anticipate is going to happen, that you can have a discussion around preemptively, right? That deviation en route is something where you're having to make a real-time decision to skirt around a rule still within acceptable limits, right? Generally, civil aviation authorities will have some sort of disclosure that the pilots are in operational control and do have a certain amount of decision making under the circumstances where they're put in a risky situation or an emergency situation like a TCAS RA. Now, what's interesting, Sean and I were just having this discussion prior, and Sean, I'll let you jump in on this, about TCAS RAs specifically, and we can actually broaden the perspective that we're looking at waiver approvals and deviations to the greater NAS. and look at, for example, a particular location and what sorts of deviations are happening because of TCAS RAs. Sean, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question, and really what it makes me think about is as a as a NAS in the higher level NAS as an operator where we know we're going to experience TCAS RAs at a particular airfield or particular arrival. It's easy to accept that because we know something is going to happen even beforehand. It just becomes a trend, and we begin to accept that, well, the TCAS RA is normal when really it really shouldn't be, right? So, and that's why the FAA is doing a great job in the industry of collaborating to investigate and evaluate hotspots, if you will, and just with the understanding that these really are not acceptable in the long term. So as those things, as we expect them to happen, don't let that become the norm, but keep your guard up even that much more. Those things really do present a great level of risk. Now, it's an interesting point, though, because a TCAS RA is a deviation that's something to help keep us safe, right? It's a positive deviation in that sense, where we've been talking about a deviation that kind of deviates from a normal or standard, whereas these kinds of things are activated barriers or safety nets in a sense. So a deviation can kind of be talked about in both lights.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to reemphasize that in a bit of a different way, an approved deviation can very much be the better decision to take, as opposed to relying on a current procedure that is already written that might not meet the needs of the situation that you're in. So it could be that, or it could be, hey, we're just trying to kind of bend the rules a little bit because we need this, we need to go, we need to get there. So it can very much be both things, but regardless of what the driving motivator is behind that, what's important is looking back then to understand how well your policies and procedures are defined for your organization. Where did you miss something? Approving that waiver one time is one thing, but if you're going to re-encounter that situation again, maybe you just need to redesign your procedures from the get-go so that you don't have to go through these approval processes that are happening very rapidly in succession up until an actual event happens, generally speaking.
Awesome. Next one is, do you ever see waivers actually being denied in your system?
That's a great question. And regardless of whether or not we see it a lot, and what I'd rather focus on is your thought as an operator behind going into that process. Are you going into your approval process for a deviation request under the premise that it is going to be accepted, right? Do you already have a preconception that you already have the justification and it happened before, and whatever it might be, and so you're going to run it through the process because you have to for formality's sake, but you expect it to already be approved? That's an open-ended question for you to consider honestly looking at your organization. I hope, and what I believe should be the norm, is that they're not always accepted. And not just for the sake of denying something, right? But because if the preconception is that you're going to go into that and it's going to be approved, then you're not necessarily looking at your organization, at that operation in the context through that risk-based lens, as honestly as you might need to be. So I'm going to pseudo answer the question and just ask for you to look at yourself and how you go into that process.
That you just struck me why you mentioned that earlier of, I filled out the form, so it should be fine.
Yeah, exactly. It's don't have a formal process for the sake of formality, right? It's meant to actually be useful for you. And I'm sure we see that all the time, right? With doing the BAO and the ISBA, you can definitely over prescribe yourself to something and then not necessarily follow through with it, or feel like you're forcing yourself to follow through with it just because it's in the manual. That manual and your documentation really should reflect your intent in your actual organization. And as long as that's defensible, that's something that's real and actually going to help you, as opposed to over prescribing something that you can't really meet the desired intent of.
Yeah. All right. One more. Do you have a way to audit these waivers, after the fact? And can you share, if that is the case, what kind of results have you seen from that?
Yeah, I think we touched on that a little bit, that we do in our system, because we have a way for you to be able to categorize your waivers, generally speaking, specific to your organization, and look at your organization over a period of time. But Sean, I'll let you take that. Any tidbits you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yes, number one, the feature set is available. I think that the second important thing is having a constant or consistent review of that statistical data. What kind of waivers are we requesting? Are we always looking for fatigue and duty waivers? And then the question is why? Let's have a conversation about that, right? Are we continuously bumping into that? Is it due to schedule pressure? Is it due to inappropriate policy? So all of this insights and statistics should lead us to that conversation about, are we normalizing a deviation that we shouldn't be? So absolutely, whether you're using our system or not, that should be a best practice as a flight department.
All right.
Okay.
Anything else, Catherine?
Nope, that is it for today. Thank you both so much for being here. And as Madeline mentioned, this is wrapping up the spring series, and I know you all will be back. Really appreciate your efforts here and the incredible insights you all give us. So thank you very much, and thank you all for attending today, and we hope we see you again soon on a BAO SafetyNet. And everyone have a good summer. Fly safe.
All right. Thank you.